may have been taught that good writing always has a thesis. There's nothing inherently wrong with the idea of a thesis, though we're often taught it's located in a single place in our writing, the last sentence of the first paragraph, right? In the next few weeks, we're going to move past the idea of a thesis and instead focus on looking at the rhetorical moves made in academic writing. In particular, we're going to look at the overarching arguments writers make, paying close attention to the way they build to the argument. Some important vocabulary we are going to be using are argument, claims, and evidence. Let's take a look. Argument is generally used to refer to the point or purpose of an article, or a book, chapter, or other writing project. Though this is close to the concept of thesis, the argument is not located solely in a thesis statement, but rather built and supported throughout the writing. In fact, though you may have been taught to identify your argument in a single thesis statement, in most academic writing, it's pretty hard to point to a single sentence and say, that's the argument, or that's their thesis. Throughout an article, essay, or chapter, the argument is developed and discussed by breaking the argument into smaller components, called claims. When combined, the claims add up to the overarching argument. The claims then support the development of the argument. But what supports the claims? Claims are supported by specific pieces of evidence. We'll take a closer look at evidence later, but let's take a closer look at arguments and claims first. Let's take a look, for instance, at the argument made by Jack Zipes in Breaking the Disney Spell. In his first sentence, Zipes writes, "It was not once upon a time, but at a certain time in history, before anyone knew what was happening, that Walt Disney cast a spell on the fairy tale, and he has held it captive ever since." Is this Zipes' argument, or is there more? We certainly know that Zipes' focus is on the way that Disney cast a spell on the fairy tale, but this sentence may not yet clearly explain Zipes' full argument. For instance, from this sentence, is it clear whether Zipes thinks the spell is a good thing or a bad thing? Is it clear what he means by holding the fairy tale captive? Indeed, Zipes himself realizes that the argument he is making is complex, and that his first statement raises many questions. In the following few paragraphs, he adds to these questions with many, many more. We can look at the introduction to Zipes' essay, the first 3 paragraphs, in fact, as laying out the territory of his argument. The full argument, however, is not really clear until we examine the claims he makes throughout his chapter. One way to look at these claims is to look at the subheadings Zipes uses to divide his argument into chunks. The first chunk is titled The Oral and Literary Fairy Tales. In this section, Zipes works chronologically through Western history to explore how oral tales were transformed by the advent of the printing press, and how the new iteration of tales were influenced by German and French traditions. At the end of this section, Zipes summarizes the evolution of the fairy tale from the 1300s, pre-printing press, to the early 1900s. He notes in particular the ways reading fairy tales became a pastime for the wealthy and their children that reinforced rigid gender roles and patriarchy. In his next section, Zipes moves from the technology of the book to the technology of the screen, focusing on ways cinema changed the fairy tale. As he shifts into his focus on Disney, Zipes uses the work done by other media scholars to point out that early animators often inserted themselves into the story being told on the screen, sometimes by breaking the illusion of the animation by actually drawing the illustrator, or the illustrator's hand or pen, into the story and erasing or redrawing the character. This illustrator had control over the product and the character. No small amount of ego there. Throughout this section, Zipes supports his claim by drawing on experts, citing, for instance, the research of Donald Crafton to support his claim that animators inserted themselves into the cartoon. He also uses examples to illustrate his claims, citing, for instance, the examples of the artist using a character's tail as a pen to redraw a portion of the cartoon. In the case of Disney, Zipes argues that though Disney used a cadre of animators who worked with factory-like precision, Disney maintained total control of the product. It was his name that appeared on the product, not the huge team of animators who actually drew the images. Though he continues to use examples throughout this section, specifically a close reading of Puss in Boots, Zipes is relying on his authority as a leading scholar in the study of fairy tales to support his claims. He ends this section by making 3 claims about the way Disney shifted the meaning of Puss in Boots from the original story written by Perrault 250 years earlier. He claims that Disney's new Puss in Boots highlighted the themes of democracy, where common folk could overturn a monarchy, technology, where innovation can empower change, and modernity, where adoption of innovation overturns tradition. In the final section of the article, the claims Zipes makes focus on Disney's first big hit, Snow White, which was made in the lull between World War I and World War II. In this section, Zipes argues that Disney made 7 small changes to the story from the original Grimm's tale. And though individually these changes are not momentous, taken in total, they represent a big shift in the meaning of the story. In particular, Zipes notes that changes to the role the dwarves play in the story and changes the prince plays in the story reinforce a particularly American tale of hard work, both the hard work of the dwarves and the menial labor of Snow White, and underscore a romantic message that a handsome man will swoop in and save the day. At the conclusion of his essay, Zipes makes 8, not one thesis, but 8 points about the impact Disney has had on the fairy tale, including the role of the animator and the technology of animation, the simplification of the characters, and the Americanization of the fairy tale. So, where does this leave us? A close reading of academic articles, essays, and chapters allows us to see that the notion of a thesis oversimplifies the writing task. Instead, we should think of an overarching argument or purpose that we're trying to work through or towards, and pay close attention to the claims that help us step through the complexity of the argument. Finally, we should pay close attention to the evidence we use to support or illustrate the claims, but more on that later.